No doubt, the Beatles are the most influential band of all time. They have made some great pieces with their innovation and style. Many bands have followed them into classic rock, including the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Red Hot Chili Peppers, etc. We can all agree that the Beatles ignited inspiration for some of the best present-day artists, but it doesn't make them immune to hate. While most of the people and bands like the Beatles, some of them don't. Today, we are going to find out why some of the other bands hated the Beatles when they were coming up, and why some people think that the Beatles are just an overrated band who doesn't deserve so much hype and fame. But before we get started, take a moment and subscribe to my channel below. Press the bell icon to get the latest notifications of all my uploads. Thank you. Now let's get started. The Who. The guitarist and the main songwriter of the band The Who, Pete Townshend, is infamously known for his sharp tongue. The Who was one of those bands that could match the energy and talent of any musician, and they were a very powerful quartet ready to compete with anyone in the world of music. This edge that the band had made Pete Townshend speak about his contemporaries and say some of the angriest and most critical words about them. He earned himself a reputation because of his aggressive comments and views regarding other bands and musicians. In 1966, The Who was coming up along with the Beatles. They were beginning to reach the top of the rock and roll pile. With their thunderous lead single, In My Generation, the band was getting quite famous among the youth. The band was using the intense energy of the young generation to pave their career. Pete, the member of The Who, often criticized the Beatles at multiple occasions. In one of his interviews, Pete referred to the Fab Four as flipping lousy. While the interviewers emphasized on the quality of music the Beatles were producing, Pete Townshend was busy criticizing the type of music the Beatles made. He said, "When you actually hear the backing tracks of the Beatles without their voices, they're flipping lousy." On another occasion, Pete was a part of an interview where everyone was talking about McCartney's recent record, Tug of War. Kurt Loder was interviewing Pete, and he said at one point that McCartney had virtually nothing to do with rock and roll. Pete replied by asking if McCartney ever really had anything to do with rock. He then answered his own question and said that I could sit down and have a conversation with Paul about rock and roll, and we'd be talking about two different things. These remarks made by the members of The Who certainly predict his hate for the Beatles. Quincy Jones. You all must have heard about Quincy Jones. Yes, the founder of the big band, the Jones Boys, which had 18 musicians. Jones has served more than 70 years in the entertainment industry and has won 27 Grammy Awards. He is a well-reputed record producer, musician, songwriter, composer, film and television producer. But he is also one of those famous people who don't share the love for the Beatles. Jones got a chance to meet the Beatles during an interview to promote a new Netflix documentary and US television special. He simply described them as the worst musicians in the world. He labeled McCartney as the worst bass player. He refused to talk about Ringo because, according to him, he didn't get the music he was making. Quincy Jones hated the Beatles, and he labeled them as no-playing motherfuckers. According to Jones, the Beatles didn't know how to perform or read classical or jazz charts, much less play them at will. Quincy Jones worked with some of the best musicians in the world. According to his standard of music, the Beatles were not the best, which is why he called them the worst musicians in the world. Why other bands and people hated the Beatles. Now that we've talked about some of the people who hated the Beatles while they were coming up, let's talk about the reasons why they did so. Accusations of copying them. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles belong to the same era, except the Stones are still together. The Beatles were the pioneers of many things in music. They were the first to start, first to get a record deal for their material, which was a big deal back then, and the first to hit the heights of the charts. They were always ahead of the Rolling Stones. While the Beatles were making their way up, they accused the Rolling Stones of copying and imitating their every step. While the two groups shared some rivalry, they were friends in general. But the Stones were hurt by the comments of John Lennon and McCartney, where they tried to belittle their band. The Stones did take inspiration from the Beatles, but they had their own style, and it is one of the reasons they still play in stadiums while the Beatles don't even exist. During their peak, the Beatles were very proud and arrogant, so fellow bands hated them for their arrogance and attitude. The Beatles were overrated. Some bands and people think the Beatles were simply a boy band with matching costumes and were overrated. When Beatlemania was taking over the States, some people believed that the Beatles were not the pioneers of psychedelic rock music. They were also not the first band to create music in the spirit of protest. Bands such as The Doors, Grateful Dead, Cream, and Velvet Underground all made psychedelic music. But the Beatles were the ones who made it popular. The Grateful Dead released an album in 1965 called Anthem of the Sun, which had psychedelic vibes before anything the Beatles created. Cream shares the same story with their album Fresh Cream, released in '66. None of the bands were given credit. Instead, the Beatles were given credit for revolutionizing rock music. Also, Bob Dylan was singing about politics and injustices long before the Beatles, while they were still just a boy band singing about holding hands, yellow submarines, and pecks on the cheek. They came into changing the world type of music sometime later. Many bands considered that the Beatles were given more credit than they deserved, which became one of the reasons why they hated them. Mimicked styles. The Beatles were always proud of the type of music they produced. They considered themselves the pioneers, as we discussed before. But in reality, some of the other bands considered them the representatives of the true pioneers. The Beatles used their pre-existing fame, added some electric guitar to go along with lyrics not only about a girl, they became so-called pioneers. The Beatles made a great impact on music, but they took some of the styles from the not-so-famous bands and incorporated them into their style and music. Some bands hate the Beatles for gathering all the fame by taking credit for the things they never started. We all love the Beatles, but these were some of the reasons why some of the bands hated them while they were rising to their peak. With this, our video comes to an end. I hope you liked the video. Are you a true Beatle fan, or are you the one who doesn't like them? Tell me in the comment section below. Also, share this video with your friends and help me grow my channel. I will see you guys with another Beatles video soon. Until then, take care folks. See you in the next video.